Once again, our pastor, Mr. Ben Faulkner.
Brethren, I'd like for us to start this sermon today by giving you the title. The title, Are You Pure in Heart? Part 3. This is the last part of this 3-part series. And with that in mind, let me ask you, what is the first thing that you tend to do when you find yourself in trouble? And I know that we would all certainly agree that every one of us from time to time, we have problems, yet we also would very quickly agree that not everyone tries to solve their problems in the same way. So let me ask, what is the best way? Or is there a best way? There are several biblical examples of how different people of God tried to solve their problems. And at the same time, there are two, I believe, that stand out. I mean, these are the two that I have. We could come up with a lot of other twos connected, but I have two in mind that I'd like for us to take somewhat of a brief look at, more of the first one than of the second one. And the first one we want to take a look at is one who clearly had more of his share of problems, and that man is David. For example, and I'm going to list out for you, and in my notes here, I have 10. I don't expect you to write these down. You can go back and look at them. In fact, I'm going to kind of give them kind of quickly, and I am going to number them. Number one, and I'm not saying this is any kind of right order or anything of how chronologically they happen, but these are biblical examples. Number one, he was pursued by King Saul. Number two, he barely escaped several assassination attempts. Number three, he had to spend a lot of his time hiding in the wilderness. Number four, once, on one occasion, his entire family was kidnapped. Number five, his friends turned against him and they were ready to kill him. Number six, he suffered the shame of committing both adultery and murder. Number seven, his son Amnon raped his daughter Tamar. Number eight, his son Absalom, brother to Tamar, killed Amnon. 9, Absalom led a revolt against David, his father. And like I said, I have 10, and there are others. Number 10, when Absalom was killed, David grieved greatly. And yes, I have verses and passages on every one, but do I need to continue? I don't think so, because I think we get the point. And brethren, the point is, David was clearly a man with many, not necessarily part of this sermon. So let me ask this question. How was he able to do this? And what is that implying? In other words, are there lessons for this for us? There are several ways, I believe, that we could actually look at to try and answer this question, but I do believe that we find one answer to the questions. First Samuel 30, verse 1. And it came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag and smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire. And had taken the women captives that were therein, they slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. Verse 5, and David's two wives were taken captives. Verse 6, and David was greatly distressed. It's an understatement, I think, for all of us. I think we would agree. For the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But, or it could be stated, in spite of all of this, in face of all of this trouble, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, or into the context of what we've just read. So after David had fled from King Saul, and I'm referring to at the time of these verses, when these verses were being lived, David was living in Ziklag. The Philistines were preparing to do battle with King Saul against Israel, and David and his men had aligned themselves with the Philistines. And itself, that's an interesting thing. That's not part of this. Yet at the same time, the Philistines did not completely trust David, and so they sent David and his men back to Ziklag. That's the story. That's what's going on here. And so when we start the reading here in verse 1, and it came to pass, and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day. So he comes there, and all of these events have taken place. And so from reading these verses, what we learn is that this town of Ziklag had been attacked and had burned by the Amalekites. We see that in verse 1. We also see then in verses 2 through 5 that we learn that the women and the children had been kidnapped, including David's family. Then in verse 6, David is obviously distressed. And on top of this, the people are ready to stone him to death for not being there when he was needed. So we ask the question, so what did David do when he lost his family and his life was being threatened? Well, let's notice the last part of verse 6. You take the verse and you can divide it into three sections, A, B, and C. And it's in the C part. And then in the King James Version, it says, but David encouraged himself in the Lord. And then in the same verse translated in the New American Standard Bible and the New King James Bible and the RSV, and in others, it said, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And so, brethren, what the first thing we see is David did in time was troubled was to strengthen himself in the Lord his God. Then with the strength that he received from God, he was then able to deal with whatever the problems were that he was facing. Therefore, I think we need to ask, what does it mean to strengthen himself in the Lord his God? Well, we could go through and we could talk about the Greek words and the Hebrew words, and I mean the Hebrew words and their meanings and all of that. But I think we could do that. I'm not, because I really think in trying to answer this question, I think a better way to answer the question is to look at some of David's Psalms that he wrote during times of trouble. Because we get a sense of, we get a feel of what was he doing for him to, and he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And so I want us to take a look at it, and I'm going to number them because it helps me to keep up with them better. Number one, fleeing from Absalom, he wrote Psalm 3. Psalm 3, verse 1. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Selah. In other words, what they're to put in another way of looking at this, they're saying God can't even help him in this situation because we're going to wipe him out. That's actually what they were intended to do. This was his son. The second one was when imprisoned in Gath, he wrote Psalm 56. Psalm 56, verse 1. Be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. He fighting daily oppresses me. Mine enemies would daily swallow me up, for they are many that fight against me. O you most high. Verse 3. What time I am afraid, I will trust in you. Number 3, when hunted by Saul, he wrote Psalm 59. So in Psalm 59, verse 1, deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Defend me from them that rise up against me. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity and save me from bloody men. For lo, they lie in wait for my soul. The mighty are gathered against me, not for my transgression, not for my sin, O God. In other words, they're not doing this because I sinned. They run and prepare themselves without my fault. Awake to help me, and behold. Number 4, hiding in the wilderness of Judah, he wrote Psalm 63. Now we're going to come back to Psalm 63 in a little bit, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on this one. So what we can see is how David strengthened himself in the Lord, I think just by looking at these Psalms. We're trying to answer the question. So what does it mean David strengthened himself in the Lord? So, and I said, if we look at some of the Psalms, I think we can come to a better, clearer, more complete understanding of what it is saying that he strengthened himself in the Lord. So we look a little bit further at Psalm 56. We learned that David would place his trust in God to help him. That's what he's telling us. Psalm 56, verse 3. What time I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God, I will praise his word. And God, I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. What difference does it make what problems they give me? I'm not going to be fearful of that. Whatever it is they do, that I put my trust in God. Verse 9, when I cry unto you, talking about into God, then shall mine enemies turn back. Now, that's a very positive statement. We're not going to really spend time on it, but that's an awesome statement. This I know, for God is for me. In God I will praise his word, and the Lord will I praise his word. Now notice verse 11. In God have I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. He repeats it, implying that is part of what it gives him the strength in his Lord. From looking at Psalm 59, so we're looking, we read some passages from these different Psalms, and now we're looking at a little bit deeper. From Psalm 59, we learned that David was determined to continue praising God for his help, for God's help. Psalm 59, verse 16. But I will sing of your power. Yes, I will sing aloud of your mercy in the morning, for you have been my defense and refuge in the day of my trouble. Now, I'm just asking, not asking for comments or show of hands or anything, but it says, in times of trouble, he says, I sing praises to you. How many times we feel like singing praises to God in the morning? In the morning, he's meaning early. He's getting up first thing in the day. He's giving praises to God for who he is. Yes, he's going through all of these trials, all of these troubles. People are trying to kill him, all of these things. And he says, and the first thing I do in the morning is I sing praises to God. Awesome. Verse 17, unto you, O my strength, will I sing, for God is my defense and the God of my mercy. Powerful lessons on how we strengthen ourselves in the Lord during times of trouble from looking at every one of these. Now, and I said we're going to look a little further, deeper into Psalm 63. So let's go to Psalm 63. This is where we see, and I'm just a very broad overview. He overcame his problem of loneliness in several ways. Part of his problem was that he was separated from everyone and all kinds of problems going on around him, and he felt all alone. But we're going to notice, and I have this as some points. One of the first things is by seeking the Lord, is by seeking God. Psalm 63, verse 1. Oh God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where no water is. Verse 2. To see your power and your glory, so shall I have seen you in the sanctuary. So as I have seen you in the sanctuary. And then the second point that we see is it is by praising and praying to God. Verse 3, because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. Verse 4, thus will I bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul shall be satisfied with the marrow and fatness. My mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. And then another one is by meditating upon God. Verse 6, we've just read, just continuously down and just seeing this, breaking this psalm down. Verse 6, when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the night watches, because you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wings will I rejoice. Brethren, in all of this, in all of these Psalms that we've actually looked at, and there are others, David is basically saying the same thing. And I have 3 points here. Again, points help me to stay on track, to know what I'm talking about, to help you know what I'm talking about. Number one, in times of trouble, put your trust in God. You know, the thing is, it doesn't make any difference what the trouble is. Remember, I read a list of 10 different things. I mean, there's more, but I just read 10 things, just 10 troubles of David, more. Whatever the trouble is, number one, put your trust in God. And you're looking for a verse, Matthew 6:33, seek you first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. You put God first in everything. Number two, stay close to him through praising him and praying to him. And then a third one is, by doing these things, we will be made strong as God supports us, as he lifts us up during these times of trouble. Now come to verse 8. My soul follows, the King James says, hard after you. Most of the other translation says, my soul follows close after you. Your right hand upholds me. You got to be really close to God for him to uphold you with his right hand. But he's there and he's saying it. He says, my soul follows close after you. And you know, brother, this, when I was going through and reading this psalm, because this whole sermon came out of, looking at a third part to, are we pure in heart? David obviously was going to be someone that comes to mind. And so I'm looking through the Psalms and I'm reading this one. And when I read this particular verse, the next thing that actually popped into my mind, it came into my mind, was Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. My soul follows close after you. Your right hand upholds me. Brethren, this is how David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And this is how he was able to face and overcome his problems with the help that the Lord God, Jehovah, gave him the strength to be able to do it. So I think that we need to ask ourselves in times of troubles, do we follow David's example? There's several here. Like I said, I just looked at some of the Psalms. There are many others. These are just the ones that I picked out. Do we follow close after God when we're in times of trouble? And you know, the answer to the question is, it's either yes or no. It's not, oh, I want to be. No, that's I don't. I'd like to, that's a no. Remember, the question is yes or no. Do we follow close after God? We're talking about times of trouble. Do we follow close after God? Yes or no? We have some examples of things to be doing, how we can do this, how we can be successful in this. Having said that, I want us to consider a few thoughts along this line. First of all, we know, I've already stated, we all face problems from day to day, even as true believers, even as part of the body of Jesus Christ. And you can list out your own kinds of troubles, but there are problems with family, there's health, there's job, there's finances, there's neighbors, there's school problems, and on and on and on it can go. And I know you could list whatever problems you have or are going through. And here's the point I'm making in stating all of this. All too often, too many of us handle the situation on our own. Right? Right. Therefore, God is simply left out of the solution. Right? Right. Too many times. And brethren, I realize that we might all know someone who went through these kinds of situations and ended up forsaking God altogether. And therefore, as a result, they no longer pray or praise or meditate on God and his way of doing things. And they stop assembling, they stop going to church, and they stop worshiping God, or they stop edifying others, as we're all instructed that we're to do. I want to tell you something without giving names or all of those or more details. But I was told one time by someone who had left the church, and I called him up and asked him if I could come visit with him. And he said, sure, come on over. And so I did. And so we got together. And succinctly, what he told me, boiling it all down in the conversation I had with him, was what he told me was that he wanted to get his life together first, then he would come back to church. Now, I don't know how that strikes you, but in the context of what we're looking at, how do you think God would react to this kind of situation or this kind of thinking? I mean, or do you think God really would even care about something like this? Well, the answer to my question, what do you think how God would react or think about a thought like this? The answer may not be the way many would answer the question. You may be somewhat surprised first, but put it in the context of that question. The heart is deceitful of all things and desperately wicked, or it could be, our better translation, it is desperately beyond cruel. I mean, desperately wicked. Okay, so what does that mean? If you think about it as desperately beyond cruel, that heightens how bad it is, doesn't it? Who can know it? Well, the answer is God knows. That's the answer. He knows. And so how do you think God reacts to statements or thoughts like this? Maybe not the way most people or many people would even try to answer. Now, I want you to hold your place or put a marker there in Jeremiah 17, because we're going to come right back, because we're going to read a couple of passages, other places. Go with me to Proverbs 28:26. 28:26. He that trusts in his own heart is a fool. I didn't write this. I just read it. He that trusts in his own heart is a fool, but whoso walks wisely, he shall be delivered. Proverbs 3, verse 5. Proverbs 3, verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways, it didn't say occasionally, sometimes, maybe, good idea. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. We either believe this statement or we don't. It's either true or it's not. And it is true. Verse 7. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Now, let's go back to Jeremiah 17 once again, and we're going to see what God actually thinks about what I just asked in the question. How do you think God is going to react to statements or thoughts like that? Jeremiah 17, verse 5, higher up in the verse, in the chapter. Jeremiah 17:5. Thus saith the Lord, curse be the man that trust in man. And makes flesh his arm, and whose heart departs from the Lord. Verse 6, for he shall be like it says, the heat that in the desert is meaning the heat of the desert, and shall not see when good comes, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, in a salt land, and not inhabited. In other words, this is unoccupiable territory. This is not a good place to be. That's what he's saying. Verse 7, blessed is the man that trusts in the Lord, and whose hope the Lord is. Remind you of David? Reminds me of David. For he shall be as a tree planted by the waters, and thus springs out her roots by the river, and shall not see when heat comes, but her leaf shall be green, and shall not be careful in the day of drought. In other words, don't have concerns about drought. Neither shall cease from yielding fruit. And this is an analogy because this is not really talking about fruits, apples and oranges and peaches and pears. This is talking about us, true believers, that we do this God's way. Now, with that in mind, I want us to notice an example where Israel, the nation of Israel, did not look to God for strength. And brethren, as incredible as this probably sounds to all of us, Israel actually put their trust in Egypt. Now, what is Egypt symbolic of? Going to the world. It's not going to God, it's going to the world. This is symbolic there. And of course, you remember Egypt, you remember they're the ones who put Israel into a captivity. And here's the situation, and yet Israel trusted Egypt and not God when the Assyrians attacked Israel. You can't make this stuff up. The strength of Pharaoh, and to trust first because of their action. God states, promised that he was going to block, he was going to put an end to, he was going to mess up their efforts. It's not going to work. This is what, a lot of ways you could come up with. He was going to put an end to Israel's efforts to solve their problems in this way. When they could go to him, they chose not to do so. And so, Isaiah 30 and verse 3, therefore shall the strength of Pharaoh be your shame, and the trust in the shadow of Egypt your confusion. Now, go to Psalm 31 verse 1. Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help and stay on horses and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong. But they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord. Verse 2, yet he also is wise. The he is referring back to the Holy One of Israel. But he's wise and will bring evil and will not call back. His words are not going to change them. It's going to happen because he said so, but will arise against the house of the evildoers and against the help of them that work iniquity. Verse 3, now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses flesh and not spirit. When the Lord shall stretch out his hand, both he and he that helps shall fall, and those that is helping is those who try to help, and those who receive the help shall fall, and they shall all fall together. Why? Because they're not putting their trust in God. And they could. I mean, think about it this way. Obviously, brethren, God wanted Israel to trust in him, not themselves and not in Egypt, the world, just like any thoughtful, loving, caring parent would desire their children to do. Go back to Isaiah 30. Isaiah 30, verse 15.